Welcome to Lead Smarter, Not Harder, your stop for how to stand out as a leader. I'm your host, Jason Davis, and this week I'm joined by Kellen Casebeer and Braedon Leslie as we talk about what managers need to know about stress and how to control it. Let's go. All right. Well, thanks for joining us today. Wanted to really get together and have a conversation about stress. It's probably a topic that's been pretty beat up over the last year and a half or so, but there's some good recent data that's come out on that. And I thought it would be good to take some time to talk about that today and really get into what managers need to know about stress, its impact on the team, and how to control it. So again, going to spend some time talking about that today. What really kind of, caused me to bring up this topic or get into this topic anyway was Gallup recently put out their global workplace report, the 2021 global workplace report. They measure quite a bit of things in there: engagement, stress, worry, things like that. But the stress levels were something in particular that I wanted to bring up. First of all, globally, this year, 43% of workers said they experienced a lot of stress in their prior workday. So that's up from 38% last year. So again, results this year at 43%. Globally, experienced a lot of stress in their prior workday. That's up from 38% last year. For the US and Canada, that's at 57% this year. It's number one in the world, not a good place to be. And that's up from 50% last year. So we're already, it's stressed out a little bit more than the rest of the world or from a global standpoint. But the rest of the world went up 5 points. We went up 7, and it's sitting at 57%. What I thought was a little more interesting actually was the report actually breaks down some gender gaps in stress levels. So the US and Canada, 62% of females said that they experienced a lot of stress in their prior day, compared to just 52% of men. So again, just bringing to light some of the things that we've heard people talking about, that we've thought of or may have heard mentioned. But I thought this was some really interesting data from Gallup that shows a lot of those disparities at the global level compared to the US, and then even more specific in the US between men and women. So to dig into this a little bit further, wanted to bring on a couple of folks today that spend a lot of time talking about stress and put a good amount of energy into it. So brought in Braedon Leslie and Kellen Casebeer, a couple of guys, like I said, that spend a lot of time digging into stress and talking about that from their perspective. So Kellen, Braedon, why don't you go ahead and spend a minute here and introduce yourselves?
Yeah, absolutely, Jason. Thank you. My name is Kellen Casebeer. I am Chief of Staff here at Leon, and basically we're a company that's trying to build the happiest, healthiest, higher performing generation of employees ever, right? And so it's this really hairy goal. It's kind of vague, but really a lot of it comes down to like this relationship between stress signals, recovery, and adaptations, right? Especially against this kind of backdrop of burnout. That's me, and really excited to have this conversation.
Cool. Yeah. Likewise, happy to be here again. My name is Braedon Leslie. I'm the chief intern at Leon. I think my background in sport and this understanding of stress responses and how to achieve optimal performance in the world of sport, and then translating that and bringing that into the world of business and how we manage our people was what really caught my attention when I, became aware of Leon. And it's something I'm personally passionate about, and I'm really passionate about sharing it with people. And so I'm glad that people like yourself, Jason, have noticed that. So I'm excited to dig in and talk about this topic today.
Yeah. No, you and like I said, definitely, the two of you are very loud about digging into this and getting at, managers and stress and really dealing with burnout and things like that. And, obviously caught some attention from myself and just from an engagement standpoint. So glad to find some good resources, some good people to really dig into this with, and some folks that are working with other people and other managers that are dealing with this themselves, right? Like I said, we've got a lot of managers that are sitting in that 57% of U.S. workers that are quite stressed out, and it's impacting people. It's impacting the people that report to them during the day. It's impacting people in their lives, when they leave work and things like that as well. So, thought it'd be a great time to really kind of put this stuff together. So. Why don't you guys spend a couple minutes talking a little bit more specifically about what you do at Leon? So, Kellen, you want to dive into that?
Yeah, absolutely. No, appreciate that. So again, we're really focused on like building the individual, right? Like we want to build the happiest, healthiest generation of employees, not employers, right? And so we're really focused on like what does it mean to build like a high performing individual. And as we've kind of gone through the process of being a startup, right, kind of having almost like your hypothesis, testing it, going through iterations of what that might look like, what we've really come to see, and honestly, you've been actually a help in this, is like there is a disconnect right now in managers, frontline managers, in the individual, right? I think you brought up 75% of people say that like the number one source of stress in their job is their manager, is their direct boss. And if you think about that against this hyper stress society and whatnot, we really wanted to look at like, how can we enable these managers to be not just managers, but like great coaches for these people, right? And what might that look like? And kind of what we've arrived at is a system where we are pulling sentiment analysis from these employees with very little time each day. We're anonymizing that data, roll it up to the manager, and we're creating this prioritization, right? So we're breaking it apart in three ways: health, resiliency, and culture. Each of those, what we call fields, is made up of two tracks. And so health is burnout and happiness. Resilience is grit and adaptability. And then culture is made up of inclusion and alignment. And so essentially what we're doing is we're helping a manager understand physiologically how are your people feeling around these sorts of constructs. Right. And then based on that, we actually also go as far as to recommend playbook activities, whether it's something to do as a team, as an individual, focus strategies, maybe some sort of kind of thematic focus over the next quarter, whatever, that is going to both help address their lowest scores, right? The ways that they need the most support, as well as leverage the ways in which this team is scoring especially high. Right. And so it's kind of this like periodization approach to performance, understanding that these are all very like dynamic things, and that the context of how your team is doing in those ways technically needs to really change the way that you do almost everything else you do. Like you basically need to know how this is doing in order to really effectively coach these people, because if you don't understand where they're coming from, you kind of might be missing the mark. And the data basically says that we've been getting worse and worse at that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that. And a couple of things that I wanted to kind of pull out of that a little bit, and we'll dive into the topic. So from your perspective, or the way that you guys are going about this anyway, it's kind of a daily check-in, daily gathering of information from employees, assuming it's not, too onerous, like a 30-question survey or anything like that, right? Yeah.
So the way I see it, basically we're asking right now 5 questions a week for individuals. And so what I tell people is we will take like 2 minutes of your time per week, and so you're right on the money. Actually, it was trending on LinkedIn the other day that like people are having burnout on surveys. Like people aren't even wanting to do the data input anymore because they've seen it so many times with like a low ROI on their time. So yeah, we're definitely shortening that up.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's good. And what I think I like most about that is that it allows managers and people to really be more proactive and less reactive to when they start to see things going the wrong way, right? You've got a constant data point and things that you can kind of continually look at and rely on to say, okay, here's where we are. And then if things start falling off a cliff a little bit, you can react before, hopefully, it starts to become, physically present, right? You can start to, and again, that's where you get into some of the AI recommendations and things like that as well, where you can, start to use some of the tools you guys provide there also. Is that good assumption?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's, we've all heard like an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. It's basically that. Is like, if you, if you think of like the threshold it would take today for a VP of sales to like go seek out some sort of like week-long, mental health for the sales team, sort of situation, it's probably a pretty high degree of burnout, right? Like they're not tons of people are like proactively seeking that out because there's like a huge time cost, and to them there's like a low ROI there. We're basically trying to go to those teams and go, hey, before it ever gets there, why don't we try to get out ahead of it, right? And we know it's not going to be 100%, but if we can take off 80% of those instances and help label specifically when it is those like top 20% that you need that, I think that that's a huge value across, basically the enterprise.
Yeah. No, that's great. Thanks for adding that in.
Yeah.
All right. So let's jump into managing stress a little bit and kind of diving a little bit deeper into how managers can manage stress themselves. And really what that impact from a stressed out manager is for an employee. So Braedon, I don't know if you want to jump in on this one, but let's talk a little bit about how stressed out managers impact employees. What do you see from stressed out managers and what that does to employees?
Yeah, no, thank you for asking. I actually listened to this really cool Google talk, and this plays into the whole idea that managers are getting burnout there. I mean, I feel for managers, first of all. I mean, not only do they have their own KPIs, do they have things that they are responsible for in the day-to-day, but they also have to manage the tasks, the goals, and the interactions of their people, right? Those that they're in charge of. And so it's an incredible ask of that person. And we've talked about this, and we spoke about it in our last call, that a lot of these managers are ill-equipped, or they've just risen to that position because they were the best suited at the given task that department is over, right? It's not that they're the leader. It's not that they asked to be there. And so there's so many different factors and inputs that are at play in this moment. So I think one thing especially is that I learned in this talk is understanding communication. Communication and a breakdown of communication leads to what they called residue. And this residue leads to misalignment, misunderstanding, there's a lack of clarity about the communication. And that just results in extra work that manager has to do to, gather the troops, get people on the same page. And that's exhausting. It's emotional labor, working with people, leading people, doing these one-on-ones, having these critical conversations. It's an emotional labor. And we're seeing how much that's affecting people in education. We're seeing how that's affecting people in healthcare, very emotionally intensive jobs. And that's what leadership is. And so managers, just as much as their people, need to be able to, one, keep a pulse in real time of where they're at, how they're performing, are they recovering or not, which direction are they trending, and then two, take care of it, get out in front of it, right? Kellen mentioned mental health webinars or seminars or having someone come speak to the company. That's great. That's a Band-Aid. It's almost more reactive, which I'm not saying those aren't great things to do, but it would have been nice to have really prevented that systemic issue in the first place, that really is the philosophy behind Leon, is giving managers and people that data and that insight into where they're at, where they're heading, and what they can do about it.
Yeah. Thanks. And great points. And one of the things that I'll pull back there a little bit is, you talked about it, and being a manager is hard. There's a lot to it. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of responsibilities. And, one of the bigger stressors are competing priorities, right? I've got different goals for different people and different people asking me to do things. The old movie Office Space, right? I've got like 7 bosses, all delivering me the same report and asking me and telling me about the same problem I had. You've got that happening all day, every day. All the while, you've got a team of people to lead that are all also going through their own things. Some may be work related, some may not be, right? And how do you, help them deal with some of the personal side of things as well? You're taking on a little bit of that psychiatrist role, therapist role almost in that space. It's a really, really tough job. So yeah, I feel for them as well.
I think also one of the whole things too is like a manager, right? Like we're talking, I think a lot of this is, we're talking like frontline manager. They are also just they're also in the context of their boss, just like an employee. And so I think a lot of times you could also make a pretty strong argument that like maybe that manager's manager is burning them out. And then that just gets passed down, right? And that's where you kind of see this like systemic burnout that can happen, where one of the whole things about being a manager is like a whole lot kind of stems off of the way that you do things, right? And I think one of the things that is definitely manifesting all over the place is like organizations that have that manager that just like puts their people through hell, essentially, like their managers below them through hell, and then that just gets passed along. And so it can be kind of funny how like you look at this frontline workforce, you're like, oh, they're burnt out, what can we do? It's like, are you maybe also look upwards and be like, is from the top down, like where is in the chain, where is this breaking down, like where are we kind of failing to take care of that next level, and then allowing that to just kind of fester.
Yeah. And the festering piece, I think, something that it occurs more and more the higher up you go, and you pointed out a lot of our conversation is around frontline managers. And I really think that is a frontline manager is the only manager that's going to get the most honest feedback from their employees. So, after that is going to start to get filtered and filtered and filtered a little bit more until finally you're the CEO and nobody wants to tell you anything that's bad, right? Like that filter just kind of keeps getting added and added and added. So to your point, right? Like how many people are telling that senior leader, like, hey, you're really riding people the wrong way. Like I've had my frontline employees come to me and say, hey, like, leave me alone, like, let me deal with it, and they're just very like, just stop, and just kind of give me that notice. But, how many people are willing to go to their VP and say something like that? Or how many people are willing to go to a C-suite leader and just say, hey, leave me alone for a little bit. I need to work on this. It's rare. And I think, to that point, that feedback around, hey, you're stressing me out and your stress is stressing me out, it just doesn't happen a lot, or it doesn't make its way to where it needs to get to.
Yeah. So go ahead, Kel.
Oh, sure. Thanks. I think there's also a little bit of like this, it's almost like at the very beginning, there's this fork in the road, right? Like, do you fundamentally want to be the organization that like prides itself on taking care of people, which is a huge, like, if that's the thing that you say you are, like, that's a big task, right? And people are going to be really bothered if you're like positioning yourself that way and then not doing it, right? It's like, it's the famous under promise, over deliver, right? And right there, if you're over promising, under deliver, I think that actually is almost worse than just like being an organization that maybe to its core is like not prioritizing that, right? And I think that that's worse still. Like, I'll make the argument all day for the one that takes care of its people, but it's almost like, at least be honest, like be transparent about what's going on here, and I'm sure that there's companies out there that are a little bit more like, hey, we're not going to be that company. And they probably attract a type that can put up with that. And like, that might actually be, a step up from being the one that like pretends to do it. And then if you are that one, again, I just think that that's like a big task you have to deliver on. And so if there is this kind of burnout festering or whatever, it again ties back to like, is this something that this organization cares about? If so, that's on all of you. Like, that's your job. And if it's not something you care about, then that's like a different discussion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it gets back to those values. And again, what's our culture going to be? And that's a lot of how you're treating people and the way you're going to continue to do that for the long term as well. So, and I think that's a good transition into kind of thinking about stress and burnout. Kellen, why don't you talk a little bit about the relationship between stress and burnout from a manager or an employee's standpoint?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, looking at stress, right? Like, there's a science of stress, and stress has been very much so like demonized, and it really has like a little bit of a bad rep, right? Because truthfully, like, we rely on stress for many things, right? Like, a life without stress is actually worse. And so I think what's important for managers and employees and really anyone to like look at their work and understand the stressful parts have value. And the equation that should be in their head is stress plus the proper recovery equals positive adaptation, right? And you'll increase your baseline capacity. Stress without that proper recovery eventually leads to burnout, inevitably, whether it's day by day and it takes 3 years until you finally cross that threshold, or, it's more of like an accelerative process. But I think that that's what people need to understand. And so, our boss always talks about like, there's a people cost to everything. right? And so as a manager, you need to understand that like anything you're asking your people to do, anything you're trying to like influence them to do, to lead them through, you should see it as like, this is basically inherently a stressor to them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And depending on how you deliver it, you might be able to, in the relationship you have, in a million different factors, it ranges from like a very low tier stress to like a really high tier stress, right? From the like, hey, can you send me an email to recap that meeting? It sounds like it really went well. That's a stress. It's small. Like it probably went well. It's good. To the like, we need to meet to put you on a PIP, right? Super high stress. And so if your goal is to succeed and perform well despite this stress, you need to understand, how do we back people out of it, or how do we allow this recovery? And I think that that's something that's missing today. I come from a background in sales. I'm a bit of like an advocate for like sales culture, sales teams. And I think the issue today is that sales teams are essentially sprinters, sprinting at revenue. But the approach to it is like taking an Olympic level sprinter and just putting them on a start line and going sprint. And then you just let them keep sprinting, right?
Yeah.
Keep going, a little further. Q4 is around the corner. Oh, new year, right? And what that is doing is it's just putting this huge amount of stress on salespeople. And traditionally, the sales function is not thinking about like deload weeks. It's not thinking about like, okay, we did this huge Q4 push, like Q1, maybe we want to like reduce the hell out of quota in hours, and if we were taking a performance approach to it, right, like a Leon might, or like any, Olympic athletes might, you would really be trying to do these like micro goals that lead up to a much larger kind of like overarching thematic goal.
Yeah. Yeah. And that makes a lot of sense. And just the way that you explain that and on this podcast, and the way that you all go about explaining that in general, I think really helped that idea of good stress, bad stress kind of click with me from a business standpoint as well. I've done a lot of reading, just for myself from a personal standpoint on working out and exercise and the importance of rest and all of that. And so I get that. And that makes a lot of sense and it clicks. But when, you guys kind of positioned, workplace stress in that similar way, and good stress, bad stress, and recovering from it in those ways as well, it was kind of like a light bulb. It's like, okay, I get what these guys do, so it was like, okay, it really starts to make sense now, and how that begins to help managers solve that problem, or really kind of work through that issue is, stress has got a negative connotation. Some is good, some is bad. And let's work through that first and identify where you can make good of it. And then where do you need to fix it otherwise?
Yeah.
So,
and the truth too, I think like something that's super important about it is the response is not to just like remove more stress. Right. And that's the thing that people, I think, are getting really wrong today, is like a lot of focus goes on like reducing stress. Like, oh, I'm starting to feel overwhelmed. I'm going to, which is fine. Like sometimes that's the right thing, right? Take some extra time off, 4-day work week, whatever. But the reality is you don't always have that flexibility, right? In like a job, right? Again, sales team, when Q4 comes around, it's like, you're not taking time off, you're ramping up, you're burnt out from the year, and now you need to do more. That's kind of a big ask. And approaching it from like a physiological perspective helps us understand how we can still ask for more in a way that like makes sense, and I think that's really important, because again, people are talking about, all of these people leaving their jobs potentially, and all of this like reshuffling of and so it's like, it's going to be very valuable if you're the organization that can hold on to your people and they can attract the good people who are looking for what's next. Like, what are they looking for? It's what we're talking about, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've talked about that a couple of times. There's so much focus right now on attaining talent and getting people in the door, right? But I think there's, a lack of focus on that internal mobility aspect. How are we making sure we keep the folks that we have in place? How are we keeping them as much as possible? And then even for the folks that go, this concept of creating, company alumni, right? Like people that you celebrate as they're walking out the door, so to speak, because you never know, they might be a boomerang employee. go out and get some great experience somewhere else, come back, bring that back to your organization, make it more fruitful. And also consulting companies do this a lot in kind of setting up that alumni network for their employees. It turns into a lot of great, just referral business as well, just from the connections and stuff like that. So I think it's, just different ways that people treat their employees. It helps to kind of get into that. So
my favorite word is ethos. Braedon about it all the time, but like, it's the ethos, right? It's like, it's the ethical kind of approach to how people do things. I think it's like everything, right? Because if you think about, like that Band of Brothers kind of archetype, right? The platoon that went through really tough, circumstance or whatever. 20 years later, they're meeting up at the bar, and the things that in those moments were the worst moments are the things that give them the most joy. Right. And there's a lot of value through getting through difficult things together. And that togetherness is really important. It's very miserable to go through really difficult things alone. Right. And so if you think about some of the most stressful things about work, it's oftentimes like paired with isolation, right? Like, oh, Kellen's on a PIP. Like, the boss and him know that, but like the team doesn't know. I'm embarrassed, like it's this weird thing. And it's like, you're basically dumping stress and then like not supporting. And then when people don't do well, it's like, of course it's not, providing the outcomes you want.
Yeah. And just to clarify, for those that don't know, PIP, Performance Improvement Plan, my assumption anyway. All right.
Yes. No, yeah.
It's clarifying acronyms. So. Yeah, it's all right. I've used so much jargon in my life. I've been able to start guessing what things mean, and I've gotten pretty good at it. So.
Oh yeah. Yeah. It's a fun game. No, I know it's bad. Bad. Our Leon alignment just went down a little bit, and it's on me.
No worries. We'll figure it out. All right. So let's talk about what managers can do about this then. So Braedon, we'll kick this one over to you. So what are 2 or 3 ways that managers can control stress, either in themselves or at the team level?
Yeah, totally. So I like to think, obviously, if you don't have Leon, finding a way to create some sort of feedback loop within your team, I think is probably one of the best places to start. People are doing all these initiatives. They're giving their people a day off. They're saying, hey, take the day off early, or we're going to do this summer break, or we're going to go on a walk, do whatever the activity is, because not everything doesn't work all the time. Does that make sense? Brian says it all the time, Kellen, that everything doesn't work all the time, and everything doesn't work for everybody, right? And so the ability to implement whatever it may be, could be a day off, could be a seminar, but then gauge and really contextualize, okay, where were we before? How were we responding? And what happened after that? I think being able to pick up on this, and that is what Leon's all about, as well as is providing insight, real-time insight in contextualizing the stress. Is it a cultural thing? Is it a communications-based thing? Is it physical? Is it health? Is it the physiology of my people? Are they so overworked that I'm creating constraint within the team to the point that they just can't work anymore, which is creating bottlenecks elsewhere kind of in the system. So one, it's got to be, I would say, creating some sort of feedback loop. And then 2, once you know kind of how your people are feeling, that should give you some clue into what I can do, right? We provide a bunch of different activities and strategies, ways to approach work, the day, how you structure meetings, activities and things you can do as a team or as an individual, whether it's mindfulness or exercise or breathing, whatever it is, right? And then seeing if that works for you. Right. One of the coolest things Brian and I talked about was that he worked with these Olympic athletes. And for one athlete, the light massage was great. And for the other, it was the deep tissue massage that really stimulated the best kind of recovery. Right. But if you were to swap that athlete would have kind of experienced the opposite, either not recover or be hurt or damaged by the intense, massage. So being able to just implement activities and strategies, and the more I learn, I think it's about managing interactions and managing communication with your people, because that's where you find breakdown of alignment. That's where you see these missed or assumptions. And so fixing communication at source, one, by knowing or having a pulse on your people, that's helpful. But then also, making sure that you have best practices with regards to communication with your team, I think is an essential non-negotiable moving forward, especially as we work apart from one another. Being able to communicate as effectively as we did before in person is going to be huge moving forward to mitigate burnout.
Yeah. I like that. And I really like the feedback loop piece. And I think, even if you can start to talk about, how do you make that a safe place for people to say things or provide feedback or let their leaders or other people know, hey, this isn't working for me, and that really gets into your second point is what works for one might not work for another. And that safe place for somebody to provide that feedback gives them an area where they don't have to do it in a team meeting, or maybe it just kind of depends on your setup, I guess. But giving people a space where they can do it one-on-one or in private or in a way that again makes them feel safe. It's obviously something important enough that they want to get out there. But I think that, like you said, that feedback loop and allowing people to kind of get things off of their chest and just say it is critically important.
Well, if I can jump in again, I think another thing, we're talking about frontline managers here, the people that have direct exposure to the majority of a company's workforce. Right. Okay. We've all been in meetings. We've all had performance reviews where they kind of, you hardly ever see this boss or this manager. And then they hand you a sheet of paper and you do whatever, you write whatever. And then it's kind of, they ask you how things are and you're like, oh, it's good. Like there's no social currency there. So I think another huge thing is it's the trust. It's built on communication, right? Is building that trust with your people, developing that social currency, because otherwise you're not going to get genuine feedback, which is critical to coming up with the right strategies. Because if your people are gaming the system and just telling you what you want to hear because they have with you, you're going to think you're implementing things. You're going to think they're better than they are. And you might implement things that are irrelevant to them. So having a really authentic way of gauging the sentiment of your people, I think, is also super, super important. That starts with relationships within the team for sure.
Yeah, precisely. I was going to say it all starts with relationships. Everything, everything starts with relationships. All right, Kellen, what are a couple of ways that, from your perspective, that managers can control stress?
Yeah, I think that was a really awesome one. I think the first one, like kind of how Braedon said, is like what I went to is like understand the input that you're relying on, right? Which is that psychological safety. Is like if you're getting garbage input and you're basing anything off it, everything after that's going to be garbage and broken. It's not going to work. And so I strongly agree with that. The second one I have actually is something that I read about that I thought was just such a good idea. And it's funny because since reading it, I've had this like affirmed to me how much so this is the case, which is trying to get micro budgets, right? Basically, part of the problem today is even if you're a frontline manager and you know exactly what's wrong with your team, if you don't have like a mechanism by which you can address it, in again, going back to the feedback loops in a time that makes sense, it's a problem. And we see that a lot right now, especially with frontline managers, because they might not know how to manage up to get what they need to make things successful. It might not have the experience with like tying together, like kind of making the business case for themselves, right? Like, hey, this is actually really worth it. And so I think like really trying to arm these frontline managers, like basically like senior leadership needs to arm their frontline managers to be able to have like discretionary decision-making ability and to try to like fight these fires like very quickly on their own. And it partially has to do with it allows that manager to become an ally to the team, right? Rather than like the adversary. I think like those managers being able to like really be quick on their feet, address things quickly. It's a way of them kind of being like, look, I'm here for you all. Like I'm really on your team, right? If people feel like that manager is like HR number 2, where it's almost like, I don't know, that manager is almost like here to protect the company from me, that's going to be an issue. And so it's kind of like decentralizing, like where these budgets come from. And what cracks me up is I had a conversation about this with someone. They described it to me and I was like, that's brilliant. Ever since, every time I go pitch Leon, right, and we're going and talking to frontline managers, the amount of times that people are like, this solves my problems perfectly, I just don't have a budget, is like mind-blowing. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like, which is fair because a lot of tools aren't like companies are not, their DNA isn't necessarily built on like frontline managers being like SaaS purchasers. And so I understand that, but it is just funny. Like, we're at most we're $450 a month for a team. And so like a manager that can't pull the trigger on that when they're sitting here going like, yeah, I lost 2 people last month and we have a top performer on LOA. I'm like, okay, $5,000 for the year. Like an organization should be like watering at its, like just drooling at like what that might mean. But I think previously, right, if you're to think about like a company in one big building, that would be less the case, right? Because I think like now, because we have kind of like decentralized working environments and working situations, it's like we need to learn to adapt to like, how do we support these people now that they're in like these big question mark environments? Like I have no idea what I can do to be supporting them.
Yeah, that's a great point of, just making sure that, the frontline managers, they're seeing this, they know it, and getting that decision-making capability and ability down to them, and ability to problem solve or start to work through things, and at least get to a point and say, all right, I have the authority to solve this problem, or I don't, and I need to roll this up to somebody that does, or authority or capability or money or whatever to solve this problem, and I need to roll it up to somebody that does, but a lot won't, right? And a lot will just assume that they don't have that space to do that. And I think that's really important, just for just speed, right? Just it's speed to market, speed to get things done, and speed to get your frontline workers answers, which are ultimately what they need.
And think about how stressful it would be to be that frontline manager who you're in charge of these people. This is your team. You understand what's going on. You know what could help them. And then you go upstream and you're like, hey, I need this, right? And you're not getting it. Like, what do you do? Right? Like these people hate you if you're not getting what they want. These people are just saying no, and that's your boss. So what are you going to do? And so now you're basically stuck in this position where even if you care about your team, you basically care about like not stirring things up with your boss more. And that's just like really damaging. And I think especially if like, I'm a little bit like of a confrontational person. So I could probably, go and try to make the case and, really maybe like try to do that kind of head-to-head thing with that person, and maybe something comes out from that. But if you assume that like not everyone's going to go back and ask again, right? Like not everyone's going to stay persistent, it can be really and maybe they just caught that VP at a bad time. They were tied up and they're just like, no, I can't bother with it. But to that manager, they're like, oh, I'll never ask for that again. And now their team is just stuck like, oh my gosh, we're so miserable. Please, for the love of God, can we get this? It's like, I think companies want to like, it sounds nice that there's like these really grand things, but like something Braedon and I came across, like scraping through Glassdoor data, is just how consistently the things that companies that have like bad reviews are doing, the worst is just like really simple things. It's not some crazy grant, it's like alignment, clarity with your boss. Like it's, square one stuff. And it's like nail that, people end up really, really happy generally. Fail that, no matter what else you're doing, people end up really miserable. And none of this had to do with like giving away Teslas and crazy, vacation policies. It's like, that's not it. That's not what people really need.
Yeah. If you can find a way to treat people well, and I know that's very broad and probably watered down, but if you can find a way to treat people well, generally that's going to do fairly well for you from a business standpoint as well. So, from a cultural and just treating people the right way is going to get you monumental gains elsewise. But
yeah. And sometimes it makes you feel crazy because it's one of those things where you go so into the weeds that you like literally do need to back out and just look at it that way. It's like, your manager, just a person, the CEO, just a person, the VP, just a person, we're just a person, we're all imperfect. And, my wife works for like a really big company, like a really, really big company, and frequently deals with people getting like really frustrated about like management decisions and stuff. And it's easy to like create this like demonized like caricature of management and stuff like that. And it cracks me up because I'm always like, man, you got to go diffuse that. Like you got to help them understand that that's just some person doing their job. They also have just some boss. And if things don't make sense to you, it very may well be that like you're absolutely right that there's a disconnect, but that person's boss just said that's just how it's going to be, and they just got to like suck it up basically.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and I've been there where your wife is, right? Working for a very large company where you've got to go through a lot of different things or red tape even to get something accomplished, right? Thinking about an office manager at my former company, if they wanted to bring on Leon for their office of 300 people, there's no way they could do it, right? Because there's so many other things that they've got to go through, and approvals, that would have to take place that they just don't have that kind of decision-making capability for their staff. And it does make it more challenging. Again, you can go all the way up the chain and all right, I understand why you might want to keep things a little more consistent and have a constant, thumb on, all right, what kind of technologies are we bringing into the organization as well? There's always another side to the story of that. Also, it's not, people generally are not, trying to be a jerk or trying to hold people down. It's just, there's different things going on, and some people manage to show that differently than others. And I think that's the difference here, right? Is how can I tell somebody, okay, this is the way it is, but not tell them, well, this is just the way it is and you got to suck it up and deal with it, right? Like, how do you turn that into a message that they can maybe take back to their team? And it's like, okay, this is what's happening. This is what's going on. Here's how we might be able to deal with this. Or, there's another way around that. But
and I think similarly, like, I'm a big fan actually, like, if you don't agree with something, it's really easy to like have a visceral reaction to disagree. But like, I challenge you, try to imagine ways that like that could be really valid. Like, go through the exercise in your head of like, okay, I'm angry at this, but like, what could make this person, while being like really good, like maybe I think that they're just being a jerk, but maybe they're actually just being super nice and fair. And it's just like, how could I justify that? And I think it's a good way of helping you catch yourself be too quick to like allow, the cortisol rush of like frustration and anger. Because the reality is we actually do have a lot of control over like the way that we experience these things. And if you want to like lower your stress, or you want to, especially like kind of high cortisol, like, arguably, so to speak, bad stress, learning to like accept things and take them as they are and try to like, work with that without letting yourself have your blood pressure spike, I think is like massively beneficial.
So I don't know if this is too much of a tangent, but, and I'll be brief, but, I worked in the residential treatment industry, which is a therapeutic industry. You work one-on-one in small groups intensively with young adults who have behavioral issues. And that's like a super emotional work. And what Kellen was talking about, this ability to humanize people. And that means going up the stream and down the stream. Upper leaders, upper management needs to be able to humanize what it's like kind of being a grunt on the front line. They need to understand it's not ideal. But those people on the bottom level looking up also need to be able to humanize their managers and understand that they're in a precarious position, that they're people too, like Kellen said, they're imperfect, right? There are other interests that are keeping them from doing maybe what they would like to do for you. And so I think that like in itself is a really powerful tool that, managers, people, everyone should be able to implement, is just being able to humanize who they're interacting with and understand that everything's a system, and they've got something going on in their life that's causing this. Probably they're not just being a total jackass to you just because they want to. Right. It's that person goes home to something. I mean, it goes so much beyond the context of the small system of my team at work. It is so much bigger, and that's a huge lift. And that's, I don't know if we'll ever get there, but starting small with your team is one place you can do that. So,
yeah. No, that's an excellent point, and I appreciate you, really kind of throwing in there. I think it's important to remember. And you said it. They go home to someone else as well, and they've got a life outside of the workplace also, and they've got dreams and things that they're trying to achieve with their life and trying to get to the next stage. And again, it's a lot of times it's the way we go about it, but humanizing people up and downstream is really, really important. So. All right, well, let's spend a couple minutes here talking about Leon then. So Leon, Braedon, why don't we get in a little bit about the vision? What does it do and why managers?
Yeah, I mean, like Kellen said at the first, Leon is about, from my words, right, equipping managers with the tools and the resources to better manage their people, right? To help their people optimize performance and become healthier and happier. That starts with, having that pulse, having an ear to the ground as to how are my people doing, right? Contextualizing the stress of my team, right? Whether it's a physiological issue or it's a cultural communications based issue. Leon provides managers that insight so that they can act accordingly in real time, not in 2 months or at mid-year or at the end of the year. Like historically, the legacy systems, quarterly reviews, semi-annual reviews that we'll then process and then we'll think about acting on. They're lengthy. Like at my last organization, I took a survey that was over 100 questions. And by the end of it, I was middle, or low. I just didn't care, right? I didn't care. And I was skewing the data, but it was bad. The approach was bad. So Leon, and like Kellen has coined, right? It's 2 minutes a week for an employee. It's one question a day, and it's 10 minutes a week for a manager, to unlock mitigating burnout, next level performance, changing the culture of your organization. It's all possible. And the lift is very little, right? There's very little, if any lift at all, which is awesome because of all the work that the system is doing in the background. The recommendations it's giving you, the data it's pulling and aggregating, it's all working to help make managing people easier for managers.
And I think to tag on to the vision too, Jason, like, I can't remember if we talked about this, but like, where does this go is like really exciting. Right now we're like Leon V1, right? Which is basically what we explained, which is a little bit of like a hypothesis or like this analogy of like, we're taking sports performance, physiological sports performance, applications, doing it to office workers more or less. Right. And it's based on an understanding of how this like physiological stress response works. But we're a company that is basically going to be Leon V2 will be like a data company, because as we see, over and over and over, based on this set of circumstances, we make this recommendation with this specific playbook implemented. Here's the delta on these scores. More and more, we're going to get better and better understandings based on team, company size, funding level, growth pattern, like function, like, anything, any way that you could divvy up teams, what works where, when, why, how, and we'll actually start to get into predictives, right? And what we're going to be doing is tying all of this data against outputs, right? Like your KPI outputs. So imagine being able to have like a sales team's Salesforce data against their Leon data and having an understanding of the correlation on each individual or team, how different metrics within Leon actually predict or drive output of like deals closed, right? And so ultimately we want to get to the point where we're going to these go-to-market teams and anyone who has like, these revenue goals and basically being like, this becomes a part of like the driver's seat that's going to get you to where you want to go, because we've seen it so many times before that we actually know what's going to work, right? And I think, you can imagine, obviously, like Gong has done an incredible job about this. The other day, they had a report come out. I think it's like a 400% ROI on their product, right, for sales teams. So it basically goes, if you don't buy our product, you're ridiculous, right? Like you just should do it because you're going to get this yield. And so, we want to get to a point where this sort of idea is just like what drives performance. So we just understand that like the beginning of this equation is physiological preparedness to perform, because without that, you're leaving a whole lot up to chance, right? And companies do not want to be leaving things up to chance when it comes to revenue generation.
No, it's spot on. And I really appreciate, especially getting into, how that, really helps managers from a time saving standpoint. And, we talked about this in a different conversation, not in this one, but really what's your ROI on time? Managers don't have a lot of it, especially at the front line, because they're dealing with so many things. And we talked about that before, a lot of the competing priorities, different goals and people problems and just things that they have to do. It really kind of starts to overrun there, and delivering them solutions in the quickest amount of time that have the best impact is really a smart way to move the needle. So. All right. Well, let's go ahead and wrap this thing up, shall we? So, real quick, each of you, Kellen, if you want to go first here, if there was one thing people should take away from our conversation today, what would that be?
Yeah. So, Assuming they've listened to the whole thing, I'm going to leave them like the one piece that I really just want to hit people in the heart. And I have to shout out Eric Mellenbeck because we had a conversation on LinkedIn about this yesterday, is I want people to take a page out of Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, and I want them to be excellent to each other. I think it's just really important to like really just consider we're a bunch of people and be very human to each other. So that's my takeaway. Braedon's probably got a big brain one for us.
No, not at all. And I should just say communication before I overthink what I want to say. But I think seriously, the more, and that's communication verbally, non-verbally, through data, like what Leon's offering, but just refining your communication processes within your team and your organization to avoid residue, to avoid poor communication of your needs, your wants, and your vision. So like having a real sit down with your people and really caring about what they have to say, and then, managing that in light of where the company needs to go. I think that's such an important conversation that, like Kellen said, from our reviews on Glassdoor, it's clearly not happening at the level it needs to, right? Maybe it's happening in the C-suite and with the VPs, but it's not happening on the ground floor. And that's it's just a loss. It's a loss for the company. It's a loss for the future of what that company wants to accomplish. So communication.
Yeah. Awesome. Love it. Thank you. All right. Well, guys, final thoughts, plugs. Where can people find you if they have any questions?
Yeah, you bet. Honestly, you want to send me an email, kellen@myleon.co. That works. I'm on LinkedIn. That's probably the best. Kellen, K-E-L-L-E-N, Casebeer, like case of beer, C-A-S-E-B-E-E-R. Send any questions you got. Love to talk to people. Love to meet with you, any of you, and hope to talk soon.
Braedon?
Yeah, I would say Kellen's a point man on this. If not, you can find our website. That's probably the best point to find everything Leon related. That's myleon.co, myleon.co.
Braedon, Kellen, hey, I really appreciate your time today. There's a lot of great nuggets that I think managers can take away from this conversation and implement. Again, have a good one. Thanks, guys.
See ya.
Thanks, Jason.